And for the same reasons I was mentioning yesterday, I was mentioning that inviting speakers to contribute to the mimetic turn is for me a way to offer a counter gift, to use most terms, to helpers in the long journey that led up to Homo mimeticus. As a matter of fact, had I not met Bill Johnsen at an MLA conference in Los Angeles, I think over 12 or 13 years ago, I don't think the home journey would have started in the first place. I still remember the scene. I had just given a paper at the MLA conference, and I was walking through the book exhibit hall, which, as most of you know, is the best chance to talk to editors directly and pitch your book proposal if you have one. I did have a book, but I was still a novice and I had no idea of how the book market worked. So I ignored the editors, thinking they were mere booksellers. Tricked by appearances, I thought what mattered were the books themselves being exhibited, which I was looking at carefully. Bill Johnsen's book stand at Michigan State University Press caught my attention, for he had a lot of books on mimesis, including translations of Girard's books, which I had read in French, as well as a series of small books titled Breakthrough in Mimetic Theory. And so I thought, somewhat arrogantly, maybe this is a series for what I'm up to. You will have guessed that Bill Johnsen is now the editor of most of my books, so the strategy of looking at the books themselves worked out in the end. But I was lucky. Few scholars have the fortune to have, as an editor, a professor of English literature with shared intellectual interests, most notably René Girard, and perhaps even more important, Joseph Conrad. For it is my work on Conrad that ultimately convinced Bill I may have some breakthrough of my own. Bill Johnsen is professor of English at Michigan State University, author of Violence and Modernism, Ibsen, Clausewitz, and Woolf, as well as the author of numerous essays on modernist Irish, British, and Scandinavian literature with special focus on myth, globalization, and mimesis. Bill Johnsen is also the general editor of the journal Contagion and of two book series at Michigan State University Press, Studies in Violence, Mimesis, and Culture, and the aforementioned series Breakthroughs in Mimetic Theory, both devoted to Girard's work and new developments in mimetic theory, of which I guess Homo mimeticus is now integral part. His talk today is titled The Enigma, or Third Pillar in René Girard's Violence and the Secret. Bill, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. And thanks for inviting everybody else. There are all these people. This doesn't often happen. I go to a conference and most of the people I don't know. And so I've heard some terrific things. So I'm grateful to you, first of all, for bringing it together. So I'll just begin. And already you've heard this is Midwest American accent. So hang in there, yeah. In La Rovina de Cache, Roberto Calasso tagged René Girard as a hedgehog, using Archilochus's distinction between knowing many things and one thing. For Calasso, Girard's one thing was the scapegoat mechanism. Girardians inevitably increased this number to two to include mimetic theory, and in my title, I've suggested a third for what Girard called in 1972 la violence essentielle. But such additions, if they are to deliver anything more than tabulation, need to be at least mapped in a preliminary way within the incorporative consolidating method of at least this hedgehog in relation to other theories of human imitation and interspecies violence. The background to my subject is the oscillating relation between mimetic theory, which includes for me the scapegoat mechanism and its relation to other theories of mimesis, and essential violence, which Girard depicts in La Violence implicitly as a self-organizing, self-regulating mechanism. To sketch this large project out, I will need at one point to hold essential violence somewhat apart from ideas about violence's contagion and catharsis, putting those in quotation marks, before relocating essential violence to mimetic theory. Girard explained that after completing Mensonge Romantique in 1961, Jojo Harari suggested that Girard's special subject, which is the circumstances of friends who become rivals more like each other as they compete more aggressively until they become violent antagonists. This subject was the primary subject of myth currently being studied by structural anthropologists and classicists. This suggests a straight line of thinking from violent modern rivals in fiction to the prohibitions which prevent rivalry and to the scapegoat mechanism embedded in ritual, which redirects rivalry in archaic culture. For Girard, ritual founded on scapegoating reveals the traces of the foundation of culture itself, which enabled the very passage from proto-human to human by curtailing reciprocal violence. In other words, this version describes a straight line from Girard's work on fiction, Mensonge romantique, and his little book on Dostoevsky to La Violence in 1972. La Violence is the point where Eric Gans, one of Girard's earliest students, says that he became seriously interested in working with Girard's ideas. But Gans asked, according to Girard, why didn't you start with a mimetic theory at the beginning of the book, rather than introducing it halfway through? Girard's provisional answer was that he wanted this book recognized as having a new subject, perhaps recognizing that the collection of essays he edited on Proust in 1962 and the little book on Dostoevsky in 1963, which followed Mensonge romantique, would not attract the attention of his new target audience of anthropologists to his new area of research. Gans asked a good question that begs a more complex answer than just readership. For years, I thought that the curious personalization of violence as a being with autonomy and intentions, which occupies the beginning of La Violence, was to give first the mythical version of human violence as deified, with desires to be placated or diverted by ritual practices that are in effect only placebos, only capable of producing catharsis as long as they are misunderstood. At points, I even thought it was Girard's attempt to sex up his subject. And Benoit Chant telling me that Girard never sells less than 20,000 copies of his books in France only drove this weak idea deeper into my thinking as an editor as well as a Girardian. None of the books in my series has sold 20,000 copies. As I consider the other speakers here at the conference, including our host, all so productive of powerful and influential books, I fear I'm only describing myself. In order to have a good idea, I have to expel a bad idea occupying its proper place. That takes me time, so I must go at it slowly. The clue to a better characterization of la violence essentielle is to remark Girard's frequent description of it in La Violence as a mécanisme, as a mechanism. He uses the term 124 times in that book, but once especially as un mécanisme autorégulateur, it's an self-organizing system. First, mapping mechanisme. For the English translation of Mensonge romantique, which was published in 1965, Girard inserted several paragraphs in the first 3 pages, which identified intersubjectivity, structural models, and systems as vital concepts for his analysis. It is not hard to see Girard formally reorienting his mimetic theory in advance of the structuralist controversy, which would be hosted the following year at Hopkins. Girard's lifelong and largely one-sided dialogue with Lévi-Strauss in particular, and with structuralism, post-structuralism, especially in his broad use of Derrida, is forecast by this intervention into the English translation. To map Girard's relation to the research in self-regulating systems is more difficult. I am not sure who Girard was reading on self-regulating systems in the late 60s. Later on, Jean-Pierre Dupuy personally and formally integrated mimetic theory and theories of self-organizing systems. Next week, I'm giving a paper on Ibsen at the Scandinavian Studies Conference. Ibsen was resolute in blocking access to his influences. He said he only read newspapers and the Bible for style. He read the newspapers provided to patrons in the cafe he visited daily and denied himself a personal library, which I believe protected him from the biographers and admirers who visited him at home. They were scandalized and frustrated by the lack of books for clues to his influences, but the picture of a luminous Strindberg on Ibsen's wall could have given them what they needed. Christian Krog's painting shows Strindberg's head going fierily into a state of nova. It's a wonderful portrait. Ibsen loved it, but Strindberg was out there hating him. All that psychic energy released out from his head here. The idea of an auto-regulating mechanism that seems to express intention maps out more easily 10 years later after the remarkable Disorder-Order Conference at Stanford in 1981, which gathered a whole generation of what Dupuy classed as the second-order cybernauts, who were researching self-regulating natural machines. Heinz von Förster, Henri Atlan, Francisco Varela, Michel Serre, Ilya Prigogine, and Isabel Stengers. They had several important meetings throughout the decade. In an interview with Nadine Dormoy later in the 80s, Girard reported that Ilya Prigogine approved of Girard's non-deterministic mechanism for the order of a human community emerging from the disorder of mob violence of all against all. They saw clearly and enthusiastically the kinship of Girard's ideas to their own work. Girard's two habits of describing violence as a being with intentions and desires to be placated and displaced, and as a mechanism which is self-regulating, sometimes overlaps, sometimes contest with each other in la violence. In the same way, Girard sometimes describes ritual purgation as a real social process, but also recognizes it as a placebo, which works only as long as misunderstanding of sacrifice survives. So we must be careful about suggesting that violence is contagious or can be purged, which can hijack our thinking. The final context for mimetic theory and essential violence, which began with la violence, is Girard's reading of Clausewitz and total war theory, which I only have time to name here and in conclusion, so I must just say where I'm heading baldly. Religion and the judicial system are the successive systems to prevent violence, to keep the peace. When they fail, we have nothing left but essential violence, which can produce nothing but itself endlessly. To develop my suggestion for what essential violence is in Girard, I will slow walk through a hypothetical episode of breakaway violence, which could be generative of the social order. I will be following Girard's model, just going slow, going real slow. If spontaneous scapegoating is a non-deterministic mechanism, then when all against one fails to appear to end violence, and it must have failed often, almost always, when something else happens, we might get a look at the threshold state. Now I'm using Prigogine's idea of dissipative structures, and it must have failed often, almost always. When something else happens, we might get a look at the threshold state, the point of bifurcation, just before the scapegoat mechanism locks in, a state where we might imagine ourselves inside the individual units about to merge, moved by some simple motive, which we might recognize as ours. We might see what else might occur after bifurcation, perhaps the source of sacrificial mechanisms for reconciliation other than scapegoating, such as the well-attested dual systems, which keep the peace constant internally for both moieties, which manage a low state of external strife, short of total war between both moieties, or even single champions fighting for each side that formed in opposition. And we should have confidence. Consciousness is a problem, of course, as neuroscientists always confess to us, yet we are better positioned than those researching self-organizing systems, which unlike humans, unlike human living organisms, cannot confess, testify, answer questions, and whose orderly and seemingly determined behavior must be carefully described using limiting terms like dispositions, emergence, and attractors to avoid the accusation of introducing divine causation or especially consciousness to determine their behavior. To describe this human motive to violence simply, we move in a frenzy against violence because we fear it, never daring to recognize our own responses as violent. It is important to emphasize, which Girard doesn't always do, that human violence is not solely the result of mimetic desire, of needs or appetites altered by human imitation. But preemptive violence, anticipating the violence of the other, is frequently discussed by Girard, especially when discussing Clausewitz, but also in discussing simple exchanges in advanced societies, such as greetings and gifts and even facial gestures. Andrew Meltzoff, Vittorio Galeazzi, and many others were part of the Mimesis and Science project funded by the Templeton Foundation and directed by Scott Garrels, which we published in 2005. We all owe them for their work for concepts central to my own thinking, like Galeazzi's shared manifold and Meltzoff's demonstration that very young children are not mere mimes. They recognize, understand the intentions of an action. Yet I wonder about one of the most famous images of Meltzoff's engagement with a newborn. Does the child's expression look like the beginning of the haka dance to you? As if the child says, I know my mother, we go way back, who the hell are you? Perhaps Meltzoff's face did not indicate carefully enough his benign intentions when he sticks out his tongue, and admittedly difficult then to smile at the same time. But the baby's face is anything but welcoming. Is this imitation or necessary defensive matching? Might mirror neurons also be part of some neural defensive system, prudently matching the gestures of others? What are the earliest signs of intra-specific human violence? Forensic archaeologists like Chris Knussel read forearm damage on skeletal remains as the result of warding off the blow of an antagonist weapon in his alternate arm. Is there any primitive tool we can think of that cannot also serve as a weapon? So this goes back very early. Human violence can produce matches for the historical record, which it would be somewhat premature to class as full-blown mimetic mirror effects. As we know, Girard usually argues that humans are creatures more mimetic than others. They copy each other with greater effect. When they copy each other's desires, they will become conflictual whenever the objects desired cannot be shared. Beyond a certain threshold, perhaps simply beyond a certain size population, hominid groups cannot restore peace through the dominance patterns which pacify animal and proto-human groups. An individual brute power and intimidation can only carry so far. But however violence begins, perhaps over water, foraging, scavenging, or later hunting, from need or from desire, it can spread throughout, entangling whoever is nearby. How does that happen? And how can order emerge? We must try to reason out this sequence, which recurs everywhere in the world in the same few patterns where violence ends violence, that it recurs as a mechanism. And we should not short circuit our own thinking by ritually depending on mythical conceptual shortcuts or agencies such as contagion or polarization or purgation, which depict, copy the steps or algorithms which emerge as a community, increases speed to get to the violent resolutions to violence that it remembers as successful. Then we must ask, why is violence copied? How is violence contagious? Why does it snowball? Why does it spread so far, so fast, like wildfire? We must not give the quick non-answer, which would be because that's the way people are violent, and that is the manner of violence to be contagious. As violence spreads, it creates a center of attention. Bystanders or outliers must address this event emerging amongst them, match, counter, equalize this expanding violence at the center which violence creates, or be engulfed themselves as violence as next victim. Girard begins with a universal claim of humans. They want peace from violence. It is as true now as it ever was. We all want peace, but we never admit to being aggressive. It is all these others who seem to be aggressive, who want what we need, who want our things, and violence is the only way to retrieve the peace that they violently interrupted. In the ensuing melee, everyone returns the violence against them. With interest, as Girard says, for we all love peace and hate violence violently. As they contest with each other, combatants become more like each other. If violence makes all the same, then as Girard reasons, it becomes easier for one person ultimately to be the same single enemy, to stand for everyone's enemy. Easier, yes, but how could that happen? One against one everywhere? Then what? Two against one, almost inevitably. What happens next after two against one? Why does it happen? It is useful here to invoke more fully Ilya Prigogine's influential model for the emergence of limited self-regulating systems, beginning in a bifurcation point, emerging out of a state far from equilibrium, which would certainly be for our model a place where a third person joins one of the two rivals to stop the violent other one, but perhaps also to hide oneself from becoming the potential next victim to the violence of the victors, as the attention of the victors expands to see if there's any more violence to be put down. This third or additional person increases their group size when joining their collective violence on yet another person, or by inviting the group to join its violence against another. And here we might say it's itself a copy of the group's violence, and perhaps consciously, but perhaps not, deflecting the group's violence away from oneself. How then does peace return from everyone matching each other's violence from blow and counter blow when reciprocal violence engulfs everyone? Eventually, a melee will exhaust the group's limited resources, will wear down into a few left, into finishing off one last. Thus, peace would return when the last antagonist or antagonists are vanquished by all who are left. Violence pushes all the way through to the most successful but least likely, the most difficult of all things not possible, in Yeats's phrase. The more lopsided the final result is, the better it is for group survival now and in the future. The best score for any future iteration is all against one. Violence which spreads itself as if contagiously, engulfing all against one, in appearance and effect, polarizes, purges, finally exhaustively into all against the last one. Ritual sacrifice commemorates, formalizes, and we can say here at this point, imitates this spontaneous outbreak and resolution of runaway violence, economizing it, but misattributing its efficacy and order to some causative force external to itself. Where does this increasingly formalized ritual come from, as opposed to a runaway mechanism? It is as if the group asked itself, what were we doing the last time peace arrived, or the last time the transcendent powers or forces that control everything indicated to us the direction towards peace in the midst of everyone fighting? They remember the spectacle of peace's first emergence. All were united in opposition to the last antagonist. Again, for the survival of the group, the best final score is all against one, the sooner the better. So, ritual copies spontaneous violence, essential violence, which is interdividual, but non-deterministic for achieving a self-regulating system. Remember, these are dissipative structures. Yeah. Ritual, however, has designs on a particular and successful outcome. To determine the sturdiest peace possible, the best placation of the gods or forces who must be the controllers of what they believe that humans cannot themselves control. Three scenarios for a non-determined mechanism emerging from the chaos of all against one yield after some point of bifurcation the three most relevant sacrificial models, and there may be more, I'm just suggesting. All against one Girard talks about, the dual system, which Simons is written so well of, 50-50, stops there, and perhaps a ritual contest of champions who represent their moieties. You can probably guess I'm writing about Achebe at this moment. All this stuff is in Achebe. Girard's entry into his research and reflection on the archaic, on the passage from hominid to the human, was to ask the question, how did they deal with their worst threat, the problem of reciprocal violence, without a judicial system like ours, which has the last violent word? But this determining sacrificial system, which mimics a non-deterministic mechanism, depends on misunderstanding the genuineness of the chaos and its random result. As Yeats's wonderful poem, Meru, says, man's life is thought. We can't help screwing it up. We can't. So this is Yeats's poem. Civilization is hooped together, brought under a rule, under the semblance of peace by manifold illusion. But man's life is thought, and he, despite his terror, cannot cease ravening through century after century, ravening, raging, and uprooting, that he may come into the desolation of reality. Egypt and Greece, goodbye, and goodbye, Rome. I love Yeats for that. It's a beautiful line. He's so reckless. It's okay. Hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, caverned in night under the drifted snow, or where that snow and winter's dreadful blast beat down upon their naked bodies, know that day brings round the night, that before dawn, his glory and his monuments are gone. And then my simple example, it's almost like your tongue, which sometimes behaves with independent curiosity. The dental hygienist tells you to keep your tongue away from that place in your mouth. And the struggle is so powerful, right? So, I mean, the mind's like that. It keeps working at these false solutions. It can't help itself. Finally, for Girard, if you come to realize you're scapegoating, that the victim is not uniquely guilty, it won't work. The placebo is revealed. Girard suggests in several places that the judicial system inherits the role and some of the accoutrements, wigs and stuff, of religious sacrifice, and his idea that the primary role of the judicial system is to take revenge in its own impartial hands, out of the hands of the aggrieved, to respond so powerfully that no further response is possible. That remains compelling to me, explaining the judicial system. It can't afford to let us to take revenge, to take the law into our own hands, right? Because of Girard's exemplary commitment to making these ideas which came to him as clear as possible, he did not always remember to remind us that most cultures do not survive the loss of their sacrificial protection. And it was by no means determined that the judicial mechanism would automatically emerge from it. In the same way, just as the sacrificial world cannot survive without misunderstanding, the suspicion that the judicial system is not impartial weakens its authority as the last word. We are now experiencing an acute loss of belief in the judicial system. And at the global level, we've never had one. At best, the dual system in a more complex form, never-ending war in Anne Hironaka's phrase. Girard's reading of Clausewitz and essential violence, of radical violence in the modern world, takes center stage in his last book. Girard's Clausewitz burrows down to disclose the generative radical of war, the two antagonists in the Wechselwirkung of hand-to-hand strife. War can get out of hand, out of our hands, into its own hands, we might say, striving to complete itself despite us. Das Streben nach dem Außersten in Clausewitz, for Girard and Benoit Chant, who read it in French, the montée aux extrêmes. And our end is our beginning. We are now back to our origins, where, as Girard says, violence cannot produce anything but itself. It's a poem written and read by a poet who grew up in Belfast, and it shows the thoroughly modern commingling of human retributive and natural violence. It's also with care for the victim and the victim's victim. Girard voices two alarms in particular in Achevé Clausewitz. His friends who are legal scholars tell him that law is finished. No one believes in it anymore. We might find this weakening of the judicial system in each of our own countries, which avoid the escalation of rivalry and revenge by the social contract of turning over retribution to the state. And of course, for global relations, there is no such arrangement. As an American, I note that we never even turned in our guns. So much for the social contract. The other warning concerns biological contagion in a world where humans affect everything. Now, again, this is from Achevé Clausewitz. Terrorist wars and looming pandemics recall the plague and thieves. The devastating nature of bird flu virus H5N1, remember this is 2007, writing this, which is a mutant that can kill hundreds of turkeys in a few hours, spreads through bird migrations, but especially thanks to air traffic. It is a pandemic that could cause hundreds of thousands of deaths in a few days, and it is a phenomenon typical of the undifferentiation now coursing across the planet. We can counter it with vaccines, so long as we share them and do not limit them to rich nations, seeing how porous borders have become between countries and between all differences in general, end of quote. We can no longer blame the gods of the system. We cannot blame nature, the weather, dubious instincts, or even the somatic for contagion, polarization, catharsis, or individual echopraxia for the violence which threatens us. The preface to De la violence à la divinité, the Grasset collection of 4 of his books preceding the Clausewitz book, but published concurrently in 2007, constitutes part of Girard's final consideration of his set of hypotheses, which he declares are even more pressing now than when they first came to him, concerning the question of violence and its relation to religion. Religion, he came to feel, was always about peace, even in its most virulent form. In Achevé Clausewitz, he says implacably that Christianity has left us with a terrible choice. Ou croire à la violence, ou ne plus y croire. The Christianisme, c'est l'incroyance. To believe in violence or no longer believe in it, Christianity is disbelief. Girard calls for research into a mimetic history, which is partially a history of the perfecting of violent warfare, paradoxically alongside a history of bettering our concern for other humans, rejecting persecution, developing hospitals and other forms of care. But as Girard says warningly, history makes sense and its meaning is terrifying. Almost done. In 2009, Girard himself chose the English title, Battling to the End. I mean, I asked him, that's what he chose. Very different from the French original Achevé Clausewitz, thus recasting a prompt for every time one picks up the book to read it. And the tone of the title, its tone weighs in to observations and insights in the book, which are by themselves quite frightening, even despairing. But I take my cue from that English title, Battling to the End, and from Girard's lifelong reading of Hölderlin, Na ist unschwer zu fassende Gott, wo aber Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch. Thank you. Sorry about not hearing the poem. I don't understand because I could hear it, but obviously you couldn't. So.
No, thanks very much, Bill, for this wonderful insight into violence, la violence dello sacré, but also Achevé Clausewitz, Alpha and Omega.